Hi, this is Siri Nelson. I am Executive Director of National Whistleblower Center, and we are here to celebrate First Responders Day with a wonderful panel on police whistleblowers. So we are so excited to have this inaugural First Responders Day panel and all of our wonderful panelists and our wonderful moderator. So I'm just going to pass it right over to Maureen McGough. She is our moderator for today, and she'll introduce the panelists and more information about this wonderful panel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. And it's such an honor to participate in this discussion with these illustrious leaders. My name is McGough. I'm Chief of Strategic Initiatives at the Policing Project at the New York University School of Law. We're a small, but we like to think pretty mighty nonprofit, and we focus on advancing democratic accountability in policing. That's basically the idea that policing is a public institution, and as such, the public deserves a meaningful say in how they're policed. So we work often at the intersection of communities, particularly those who are most impacted by police activities, policing with a particular focus on police leaders, and private industry, business, and technology. This is such a critically important issue, and I think this panel is really well timed. You know, in the 2 years since the police murder of George Floyd, it's been a particularly fraught time in policing. I know that goes without saying. And with that fraught time, there's been this pretty historic call for reform. But actual meaningful, sustainable change, it's been pretty slow to come. And this panel is exploring one of the critically important issues that contributes to the maintenance of the status quo in policing in this country. So frontline police officers who witness misconduct within their ranks, they're uniquely and sometimes solely positioned to expose it, but many stay silent, in part because they're aware of the likely repercussions that await officers who, quote unquote, turn on their fellow officers. I think, you know, a lot of us have heard a lot about that blue wall of silence, but it does become strangely porous, I think, when we start talking about protecting the identity of whistleblowing cops, making them particularly vulnerable to any manner of retaliation. I know this probably goes without saying, but people who report misconduct within policing are routinely isolated, denied backup, harassed by their fellow officers, threatened, subject to specious investigations, subjected to fitness of duty evaluations, terminated, even decertified in extraordinary cases, and the list goes on. And importantly, these lamplighters are police officers who possess the kind of moral courage that we hope our officers would possess. And such moral courage, it takes more than just dedication and commitment. It requires standing up to colleagues who in many cases have become like family over the years. It takes standing up to power and to sort of the forces of greed and corruption that drive the status quo. Lamplighters don't just sort of run into the line of danger. They're doing so at the risk of their own career and sometimes the sort of sanity of their own life. So much more needs to be done to protect and support these lamplighters. And we're really grateful to the work of the organizations that are represented on this call to do that work and give them the support and recognition and protection that they so seriously deserve. You know, until there's national recognition and understanding of these issues and legislation that's actually developed to address them, whistleblowing in law enforcement will remain an entirely too rare phenomenon, and the status quo will prevail. So I know that sounds a little bit doom and gloom, but we've actually assembled, I think, exactly the panel that needs to be assembled to figure out a path forward and to lay a foundation for progress in this critically important area. First, you're going to be hearing from Chief Art Acevedo. He's the former chief in Austin Police Department, Houston Police Department, most recently Miami PD, a man who needs no introduction and whose bio could take up this whole hour. He's going to share his perspective on whistleblowing in the profession as a tenured executive. We'll then hear from Ms. Shannon Spalding. She's a 25-year law enforcement veteran who became a police whistleblower in 2007. She'll share that experience with you, sort of her experiences with the importance of whistleblowing, the retaliation that ensued, and the overarching impact it had on her both personally and professionally. Next, we'll turn things over to Ms. Jackie Garrick, who is the founder of Whistleblowers of America And she'll discuss the themes that she's seen in her career in whistleblowing and the types of support that are critically needed and immediately needed to help address some of these issues moving forward. We then are going to have a lot of time for Q&A at the end. We really want to hear from you. This is a really unique opportunity to connect with national leaders in the space and hear their perspectives. So if you're looking for thoughts, guidance, priorities, these are the folks that can give you that. So I think without further ado, we're going to go ahead and just turn things over to Chief Acevedo.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Doc. Thanks for having me on, and thank you all, the panelists and everybody listening in. You know, whistleblowing is something that there's a reason in this nation that we're supposed to be a nation of laws, has statutes at the federal and state, and in some instances, local levels of government that are supposed to protect whistleblowers. But despite those protections, engaging in whistleblowing is a very challenging proposition. Unfortunately, when you do blow the whistle, you find very quickly that you are isolated from a lot of folks. You're the person no one wants to talk to. And, you know, I can't really talk about Miami. I think if you just Google Miami, you'll see that there's some open cases in Miami, both in federal court and in a criminal case with the Broward County DA's office, state attorney's office. So I can't talk about that. But back in my days in the state of California, I actually ended up blowing the whistle on some issues that you can find online. And I can tell you, I did it at the rank of assistant chief. And for 4 years, from the moment that I started reporting first to my superiors, and then unfortunately, because the department basically told me to pound sand, mind my own business. And I remember telling the second highest ranking individual in the organization that the rule of law is my business. And I'll just tell you very quickly what occurred. And that is that the leadership in that department at the highest level, the highest person in the department, decided to allow a very small handful of officers that were part of the union, the police union, to remain beyond the mandatory retirement age so they can spike their retirements. And the other issue was the use of, we called it chief's disease. That's what we coined the phrase chief's disease. That was really the manipulation and misuse and the abuse of workman's comp claims, where individuals would receive not just a regular retirement, but also a disability retirement, so they can have 50% for life, tax-free on the retirement. I can just go on the line. So I did blow the whistle. First, I had to do it internally with my chain of command. Then I went to the oversight agency at the Business Transportation and Housing Agency. The department fell under that organization at the state level and was ignored. And so thank God for the First Amendment and the free media. Because ultimately, I turned to the media to bring attention to what was a violation of 21-130 of the government code, and then the workman's comp stuff. I don't remember off the top of my head, but at the end of the day, what occurred was retaliation, whether it was from assignments, promotions. I was actually went through a promotional process to get my second star from assistant chief to chief. And the individuals I had complained on, blew the whistle on, were actually the panel members. It's 100% oral interview. And in that interview, which was taped, I was retaliated against, my rights were violated. And, you know, I'm known not to have much to say and be a wallflower and never have an opinion and really can't articulate anything. So they scored me last in that interview. And to make a long story short, I had to actually file another complaint besides my whistleblowing on the promotional process. To the folks out there that are going to blow the whistle, make sure that, number one, make sure that you're doing it based on facts and not emotion. Based on the evidence and not your personal opinion, because you are going to put yourself at risk. For 4 years, I was under constant on and off under investigation, being surveilled. I can just go on down the line. thank God that, when you know policy and the law and you wrap yourself around policy and the law, eventually it will help you. But having said that, my family and I almost had to declare bankruptcy. A lawsuit was solicited against me. I can just go on down the line, and I would just tell folks that if I had to do it all over again tomorrow, I would do it all over again. Because I think when we take that oath of office, I'll never forget when I was told, hey, the commissioner brought you to the dance. I said, well, you know what? I'm not a performer. I don't dance for anybody. I took an oath to the Constitution of the United States and an oath to the Constitution of the state of California. And my loyalty is to the rule of law. And so, again, I look forward to the conversation, but I just have so much respect for people like the Cervicals of the world that at the detective level, at that rank and file, because if I almost got destroyed, I broke 4 teeth. 4 teeth. Woke up one morning, were broken from what I went through as an assistant chief with a lot of experience. Your lower ranked people, you're heroes when you come forward. So I'm always available if anybody needs advice, not legal advice, but any other advice or a shoulder to lean on. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Chief. Speaking of heroes, I think that's an excellent transition over to Ms. Spalding. If you could please share your story.
Oh, well, thank you for that. Hi, everyone. My name is Shannon Spalding. I started my career in law enforcement nearly 27 years ago in the Chicago PD on the south side of the city of Chicago. It was home to some of the worst housing projects in the nation, and I worked with some of the best officers, or so I thought at the time. Little did I know that these officers I admired were actually criminals that have come on the job to obtain a badge to further their criminal enterprise. Later, I became an undercover officer in the organized crime division of the Chicago Police Department. Basically, I would purchase narcotics controlled buys to gain information and intelligence on who is actually supplying the upper levels of the narcotics trade within the Chicago Police Department and surrounding areas. Unfortunately, all of the intelligence that my partner and I were gathering throughout all of these long-term conspiracies continued to point to some of the same people. And we discovered that our very own officers, the same officers I started my career with and I admired, were actually running the narcotics trade. Now, remember, these are sworn officers and supervisors working on the Chicago Police Department. Well, we didn't want to believe this, but the evidence is the evidence. And we knew we had to continue the investigation, but we also knew what was going to happen, because when you enter the academy and stuff, you learn all too quickly about the code of silence and what happens to you if you cross that blue thin line. Well, in 2006, my partner and I went to work with the FBI. And at this time, we had begun a criminal conspiracy investigation on a federal level that we dubbed Operation Brass Tacks, into those same officers, Ronald Watts, Khalat Muhammad, and what we would discover would be so many more. But unfortunately, we were not at the FBI too long when we discovered that one of the special agents in charge assigned to work with us, he was part of the crime wave. He was actually no better than the officers we were investigating. So now we're at the FBI to investigate the Chicago Police Department, and we have a corrupt agent. My partner and I are now going to work with the Department of Justice to investigate corruption in the FBI, and we're working with the FBI to investigate the corruption in the Chicago Police Department. And you have to remember, we're undercover narcotics officers. By now, our head is spinning, and we are saying, where does this corruption end within law enforcement? And what happens if the DOJ is corrupt? Where do you go? Well, who knows where police corruption ends? It seems to be openly tolerated at all levels of supervision across multiple agencies. And it doesn't stop at state or local. It goes federal. It just keeps going up. So as an officer, where can you go if you're reporting police corruption? Unfortunately, right now, there's not many places that you can go. there is currently no safe channel or process for an officer to come forward. Well, CPD, the Chicago Police Department, was actively trying to minimize our investigation, which now had turned into be over a dozen sworn members, including top-ranking members of the Chicago Police Department that had been running a full-blown criminal enterprise for nearly 2 decades without fear of prosecution. Okay, they were being protected by their own. So the police department thought it was a good idea to reveal our identities as undercover officers to the targets of the investigation. Now you have to remember, we're investigating our own. We're investigating bosses that we report to. So this becomes a death sentence, really. Immediately, the severe retaliation and death threats, they began and they continued on a daily basis. And every day, the retaliation became worse and worse. And just when you thought you've seen the worst of it, and you hadn't, and it continued for years. It became so bad that my partner and I were actually forced to file a whistleblower lawsuit because we were under the impression that it would give us federal protection. Well, it didn't. Even though a judge would tell the police department, stop retaliating, they didn't do it. They decided we don't have to listen. And unfortunately, that just seems to be across the board. There's no accountability. In fact, the Chicago Police Department thought it was a good idea to make my partner and I report to the very same bosses that we named as defendants in our whistleblower case. Now, at this time, we had transitioned to be working with the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Apprehension Task Force in Chicago because we could no longer be undercover because our lives were in danger. And here, every day we would go to work, it was like the Chicago Police Department tied a stake around our neck and threw us in the lion's den and said, good luck getting out alive. Well, CPD was very successful at minimizing our federal investigation. In fact, it went from all of those high-ranking department officials down to two sworn members, Ronald Watts, Khalat Muhammad, serving 18 and 22 months in federal prison when it should have been 30 or 40 years, at the very minimum 20. But that was a slap on the wrist for them and a slap in the face for us. But our investigation actually was not in vain. For the first time in Chicago Police Department history, we had active officers had come forward and reported criminal conduct within the department. So we were able to get the then sitting Mayor Rahm Emanuel to admit publicly that there indeed was a code of silence alive and well in the Chicago Police Department. And that was historic. It has never happened before. In addition to that, the code of silence finally being acknowledged, our federal investigation would become just the entire defense for the exoneration to go ahead and overturn wrongful convictions at a historical proportion. You see, in 2015, Josh Tefferin from the Exoneration Project, he approached me and asked me if I would assist in exonerating Ben Baker. Ben Baker would become the first of 233 wrongful convictions tossed out using our investigation as the evidence that these people were all convicted by the targets of our investigation. And that has changed the landscape of the city of Chicago and the police department. And that's great work being done. And it's not over, it still continues to this day. And more people will be exonerated coming forward. But whistleblowing, especially within law enforcement, comes at a very high price to officers. In fact, it's pretty much a life sentence. And I want to briefly talk about Frank Serpico, as Art Acevedo had mentioned. Most of us are familiar with his name. He is essentially the godfather right? The godfather of whistleblowers for law enforcement. He is the pioneer that came before us. And I don't know about other whistleblowers, but there were times that I would think, okay, if he did it, I can get through it. Now, I admired what he had done, and I thought he had great courage, but I never set out to be a whistleblower. Nobody wants to walk in those shoes, right? It's very, very hard. And you just really have nowhere to go. But I want to tell you a little bit about Frank Serpico. When he, in 1970, he went and talked to the New York Times in an attempt to expose all of the corruption that was going on in the New York Police Department. Well, my partner and I, faced with so many death threats within the department, coming from the bosses of high-ranking chiefs and chiefs of IED, and in the superintendent's office, swearing that we weren't going to make it home. We were forced as well to go to the media, not because we wanted attention, but because we felt that if we didn't speak loud and get our message out there, that we would end up dead. And this was probably one of the only ways that we might actually survive this. So in 1970, Frank Serpico did the same thing. And as we just heard, Art Acevedo had to, because it's a form of survival when you have nowhere as a whistleblower to turn. In October of 1971, Frank Serpico testified before the Knapp Commission that the New York Police Department was corrupt and actually on the tape. Now, I want to point out a few things that Frank Serpico said because they're very important. During his testimony, he stated that it was his sincere hope that no officer in the future would experience the same frustration and anxiety that he was subjected to, and that the atmosphere does not yet exist. This was in 1971, in which an honest officer can report without fear of ridicule or reprisal. And we must create an atmosphere where the dishonest officer fears the honest one. Well, what I can tell you is that in 1971, this was the sincere hope of Frank Serpico. In 2016, my case, along with my partner's case, went before a federal judge. That is 45 and a half years after Frank Serpico testified, and nothing really changed. 45 and a half years, and I basically was walking in the same shoes as Frank Serpico. That is nearly a half a century. That is, that is so long. Things have got to change, and they can. See, what has happened to me, it keeps happening on police everywhere who defend the public instead of corruptly exploiting it. What's inexcusable is that they cannot currently defend themselves. Okay, if they blow the whistle to defend the public. One reason that the blue wall of silence remains intact is that officers have no credible legal rights, and they're left beating their heads against the wall, right? Where do they go? But to the same department that is conducting the retaliation against them, that doesn't really work. And that has to change, and it can change with your help. Right now, Representative Gerald Conley's Special Law Enforcement Act HR 6762 would create independent investigations of misconduct and best practice whistleblower rights to protect everyone, cop, victim, and citizen witnesses. Who would essentially report any misconduct, and that would eliminate the fear of retaliation. So let's remember HR 6762. Senators Booker and Grassley are working on a bipartisan companion bill in the Senate, and I'm asking you guys in the audience to please contact their office and offer your support. In fact, we can't make these necessary changes without your help. The politicians listen to the voters. So if you could continue to support our work so we can rid our departments of corrupt officers that never should have gotten a badge in the first place, it could go a long way to save a lot of lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Spalding. Now I'm going to turn things over to Ms. Jackie Garrick, who has a really great insight in terms of a macro level of sort of trends in whistleblowing in America and what the critical needs are and levers we should be pulling to better support people who do the work.
Yes, thank you. And it's an honor to be included on this panel. I am not a police officer, never was. I was a former Army officer, and I'm a social worker by background. So my perspective of all of this begins with combat trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicide prevention have been my areas of expertise over the years. But I did become a whistleblower in around 2014 at the Pentagon in relation to suicide prevention funding. And as this process was evolving around me, I began to feel and see things and started to talk to other whistleblowers that reminded me very much about combat veteran and the trauma that they go through. They used similar language in a battle for my life, fighting, talking about the imbalance of justice and the betrayal of authority. I had one woman call it being professionally gang raped. And it was actually a conversation with a federal law enforcement officer who I had randomly connected with through LinkedIn, who said to me that she was so glad that we were talking about this. She felt there was nobody else she could talk to, and she had her gun and she was contemplating suicide. And that just was like a lamp being lit for me, and that it made me realize how similar and how real this was to everything I knew about PTSD. So my next phone call was to an attorney, and I said, I want to really incorporate Whistleblowers of America as a trauma-informed peer support network using all the evidence-based research and materials that I knew worked with combat vets, and I really thought we can apply it to whistleblowers as an organization. And so that's what we did in 2017. So we've been doing this now for about 5 years, and we've connected probably with over 900 employees across different spectrums with police officers, whether they're federal, local, municipal, that have connected with Whistleblowers of America. So a lot of my veterans, my police officers I know are tuned in today, so some shout outs. I'm excited that we're having this conversation. So one of the things I heard both Art and Shannon talk about was the retaliation and the toxic tactics, as I call them, that were used against them. But, you know, I'm a social worker. I've done psychosocial assessments in the past, trying to understand how do you diagnose somebody, mostly again, combat trauma, with PTSD. And then I was trying to look at the different tools and the evidence for understanding when it's been the workplace that was the hostile environment. And how do we then look at these things? So I worked on developing again, the toxic tactics of retaliation, and started to codify things like gaslighting, marginalizing, mobbing, shunning, devaluing, double binding, counter accusing, bullying, and some of these other things that people experience. And we put them into very specific buckets with indicators so that you can actually start to do these evaluations. I am like this close to getting a book published, The Psychosocial Impacts of Whistleblower Retaliation, Shattering Employee Resilience in the Workplace Promise with Springer, so that we can really begin to build out the literature on how is this harmful. So one of the examples I gravitate to when I talk about this is, so if you're being gaslit, you're having your judgment and your memories questioned and impugned, how does that internalize? That becomes this ruminating, this constant thinking about these intrusive thoughts, nightmares. I think Shannon mentioned, or Art mentioned, the teeth grinding. Those are symptoms of the trauma. And the trauma is two parts. It's the original witnessing of the wrongdoing. So police officers and narcotics on the take, knowing that people have been wrongfully incarcerated or people have been wrongfully harmed. Though that's a trauma of witnessing. The trauma of experiencing then comes from having done the right thing and dealing with the retaliation. It's that betrayal of those people in authority. So when you're being gaslit and you're having these memories questioned, the goal is to silence you into thinking, well, maybe I did get this wrong, or I did misunderstand. And that ruminating and that questioning becomes part of the symptomatology. Other things like mobbing, devaluing, and shunning, that ostracism, is all part of then these feelings of wanting to avoid the trauma, wanting to avoid. So even though you're in it and you're battling it, there's that numbing and that emotional shutting down, the reactivity to the stimuli of the trauma, those triggering moments that just set you on edge. It's that not being able to let it go, not being able to put it down, having your family influenced by this. And we see just like with other intergenerational transmission of trauma, we see whistleblowers and their families having to go through this and survive this. So all of these symptoms then become part of what I think leads to post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, suicidality. We've lost whistleblowers to suicide. There was one of the cases that I've tried to really analyze was the suicide of a OIG special agent who was being asked to cover up a crime. He didn't want to cover up the crime, wrote a letter to Senator Grassley, went back was in the office, went to his car in the parking lot of his office and overdosed on medication in the trunk of his car on the campus of where he worked. And, oh, well, it really had nothing to do with the workplace. Well, when somebody suicides at a chosen location like that, there's usually an indication of where that problem is. So we see these factors interplay with each other. We've also looked at like how this is a moral injury, and that the moral injury itself becomes the serious injury related to the trauma. So what I've been trying to do is help people look at ways to recover. And the tool I use is our peer support network through Whistleblowers of America, which is a very small nonprofit. We rely also, as I think Siri mentioned earlier, donations, sponsors. We do not charge for the peer support. We do not charge for any of our information, our services, our advocacy, our connecting. We do refer to other law firms that have worked with us, and we try to get people and their cases to the right place. But we're at the same time also trying to make sure they're taking care of themselves, that they're healthy, that they're doing all the right things. I have a special group I think of as there are VA police officers that are stuck in this catch-22. And when they come together and they talk to each other, we can work through like, okay, so what does this mean? And how is this a problem? They are in a unique situation, whereas police officers, they're not reporting really to other police officers. Ultimately, they're reporting to medical center directors, and they have this conflict of interest to cover up these crimes. I saw Bruce Sackman was logging in earlier. He wrote the book Behind the Murder Curtain. So how do medical serial killers operate at VA medical centers and get away with murdering our nation's heroes, our fellow veterans, is because there is this desire to cover up these crimes, sort of what Shannon was identifying as well, that you have systems invested in the wrongdoing. So there's no real reason for them to want these stories to be told. And yet I think when we come together and when we share these experiences and we share these stories, the more we bring them to the light of day, the less the powers that be can cover them up and can continue to perpetration. So even though we're small, I think of us as mighty, because when we join our voices together, we can be united in speaking truth to power. And I think that gives us a lot of strength to overcome some of the retaliation. I call it restorative justice for the victims, the whistleblowers in this case, who need to be heard and bring their stories to the light of day. And so that we can have an honest examination of what these problems are, because until we do that, there is no accountability. There is no ability to for compensatory damages when we don't understand the impacts of retaliation and the harm it causes. And then there is no transparency. So we need to open up the aperture on those three things. And I'm hoping we can open up more of this discussion today in the next 20 minutes that we have left, I guess. And I'm going to turn this back over to Megan for her leadership on where we take this conversation next.
Thank you so much. And I believe there is an opportunity for folks who are tuned in to ask questions through LinkedIn. So now is the time to do it. And again, please do take advantage of this wonderful opportunity to connect with these national experts. I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative as people are getting their questions into LinkedIn. And I'm just curious, you all have done extraordinary work, both sort of going through the experience and in some cases the trauma of whistleblowing, and coming out the other side and advocating for a better future for people who are coming in your footsteps. And I'm curious I'm sure you've thought deeply about this. And Shannon, I believe you touched on this a little bit in art as well, but what advice do you have for someone who is tuning in because they are in the midst of what you experienced many years ago? And, what are some lessons you learned perhaps the hard way that you'd like to share with people so they don't perhaps have to deal with quite the same amount of retaliation and trauma that you all did?
So what I would say is if you see something and you are contemplating whether or not you should report it, I absolutely encourage you to come forward. Right now, in the current climate that we live in, I cannot tell you that it will not negatively impact every aspect of your life. But what I can share with you is that when I was going through this in 2016, I actually started the investigation in 2004. It went official with the FBI in 2006. So it's been a long time, right? But what I can tell you is there have been some changes after 2016. We're doing this event. There are support groups through Jackie. And I will tell you a story I will share with you. And this should resonate to anyone that comes across a whistleblower that is thinking or turns to you and says, I'm thinking of doing this, I'm struggling. I too was at the end of my rope and I had the gun and I was ready to pull the trigger. I called a man named Craig Futterman, who works with the University of Chicago, runs the Mandel Clinic, the police accountability. And I went to him at the end of my rope and I was confident. I just wanted to tell someone everything because I was confident the police department was going to kill me. And I thought before I let them kill me, I'm just gonna take that option away from them. But before I left, he sat there with a man named Jamie Calvin that became a very good friend of mine. He said three words that kept me going. I believe you. It was the first time in 5 years that someone didn't say you're crazy, it didn't happen, you're psychologically unfit for duty. You should go home and kill yourself, blah, blah, blah. So when you come across someone, 3 words changed my life. And now it's helping exonerate people. My advice to you is what Art said. You have to be sure of your facts. You have to make sure this is a rock solid situation, fact-based only. Take your emotions out of it. This is not something that you go into because you're mad at your employer. This is for true criminal conduct that has to be exposed. So you have to be doing it solely for the right reasons, right? We're officers. We're sworn to protect and serve our communities. So if you come across something, you need to seek out. You can go to shannonspalding.com. You can contact Jackie. I'm sure you can reach out to Art on Twitter, anyone. And you do have support now. You won't walk alone ever. So come forward and we will support you. And together we will get you representation. Jackie will help you, we'll get you counseling. And I walked alone, other than my faith in the Lord and my partner, I walked alone. But going forward, you're not going to walk alone. We are banding together to help you. So please connect with us, lamplighters.org, any of us. We're willing to help you. We'll direct you, and you're not alone. We'll fight this together.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Anything to add, Art or Jackie?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that when people tell me what's going on, I'm like, okay, the first thing you need to do is get organized. Get yourself a binder. It could be electronic, but the visual image of a binder. And start to put in everything that you have. Start with your own resume. Start with your org chart. Have a timeline, because the first conversation you really want to have, besides with your family, is with an attorney. And you need to have the right attorney, like an employment lawyer, not your divorce lawyer. And you need to have all your information ready. You need to have a prepared, informed conversation and practice your elevator speech. What's the 3 minutes of what you need to tell somebody so that they understand what your case is? What I find happens often with whistleblowers is they want to send you reams of paper. Nobody's going to sit down with 1,000 words or 1,000 pages and try to siphon through what your story is, unless you can really organize it and make it compelling for them. And I love what somebody said earlier about the difference between what's fact and what is opinion. I'll get somebody who'll say, oh, I have a lot of evidence, and they'll send me emails, and it'll be all emails that they wrote about what they think, as opposed to anything that's informative or responsive. So I think to me, that's a really important piece, is just the getting organized, own your narrative, know what your family thinks, and be ready to figure out what the financial obligations might be for all of this, and have a support network, like know who your allies are. And not everybody is the same kind of ally. So think through that as well.
Thank you, Jackie. Art, anything to add there?
I would add that it's really important to be prepared to do the work yourself.
Yes.
Once you launch, you need to be in it. You can't do this half-cocked. You cannot do this half-hearted. Once you launch, once you let the toothpaste out of the tube, you cannot put it back in. So you have to be prepared to go alone for the long haul. Keep in mind that, at least when I went through this in 2003, it started. It was a 4-year journey, and I couldn't find attorneys that would take the case to defend me. I had to do a lot of the stuff myself. As a matter of fact, I ended up with an attorney that was a small-time attorney. The government will motion you to death. They have deep pockets. And what really frustrated me was that I considered the Attorney General they took an oath of office too. And rather than protecting the whistleblower and representing the whistleblower, they were representing the people that I blew the whistle on. It just did not make sense to me. So while the people that I complained about had all of the government on their side, the government employee that actually was bringing forth the complaints, by the way, on behalf of my subordinates, civilian subordinates at the communications center that brought this, I didn't know about this unlawful deal in violation of 2130. It was our dispatch supervisors that said, how is this happening? That's how it was brought to my attention. Could you imagine how embarrassing that was for an assistant chief, to be asked by people that are really behind the scene heroes, that are underpaid, undervalued, and here we are breaking the law to put more feathers and more money in the pockets of a handful of people. So be prepared to do the work. Most of us that are in a position to blow the whistle, we're usually people that have the experience in terms of investigators. Use your skills and your experience to start putting together your own exhibits, your own complaints. And again, it's not for the weak of heart. If you do it, you've got it prepared to go all the way. So you make sure that you're prepared to go the distance.
I would like to I would like to add one more thing to that. Actually, two things, if I may. One thing that, Jackie, you touched on, and it reminded me that became invaluable is every single day when I started to blow the whistle, because what they do is they convince you you're crazy. It never happened. Even my own FOP was like, there is no code of silence. It's only a movie. I started to every single day. I don't care if it's 5 minutes or at the end of the night when you come home or in the morning, just jot down what really happened, because you're going to go through so much emotional, physical, and emotional trauma that you're going to have a hard time keeping everything straight, and document who was there on what day, because they're going to rely on facts. Oh, you're crazy. It didn't happen. Well, I know this boss was here on this day and this one was here and this is what happened. It became very, very important. And I just began documenting things on my Google Calendar because I was so in fear of dying. I thought I was going to be killed, but that saved the investigation. And the other thing is, like Art said, it was very difficult to find an attorney, any attorney, that didn't have a hidden agenda. Chicago, unfortunately, it's my hometown. It's one of the most corrupt places in the nation. And everybody seemed to have a hidden agenda. I want to do this because I could then, build my business or this and this. But think outside of the box. You want to go to someone that has nothing to gain by helping you. And even if that is going to, like Craig Futterman through the University of Chicago, or somebody that has no hidden agenda, because a lot of times you become further victimized by the people you trust to represent you. So proceed with caution and trust your gut.
So, the one thing, the elephant in the living room is the weaponization of these fitness for duty exams, and your mental health becomes a weapon used against you. And I get that that's because they're trying to, discredit your ability to be an honest reporter and own a narrative. But I think we really need to encourage people that they have to take care of themselves first. So I believe that even if you have to do it out of pocket or privately to get help, seek mental health counseling and keep your you can keep that a secret. But at some point, I think Tom Devine is on here. I think I saw him commenting that what the attorneys will need to prove the damages for those pain and suffering is they're going to need to see how and when you got help. And I think we really need to do a lot of work in this area. It's part of my main mission is to train attorneys and lawyers and judges that these are weaponized diagnoses, but the true diagnosis is that this PTSD, depression, anxiety is work related. It was caused by the retaliation. So yeah, if they want to say that you have PTSD and they want to say all these things about you, well, then they have to buy it. They own it. And I think we need to turn that around in a way that the courts understand that the judgment that they're trying to question and these fitness for duty evaluations that they're forcing people to go through is all subject to the retaliation. And that is a piece of this, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. Really important reminder. And sort of related to that, there was a comment in the chat from Amy Johnson, who's a former New Jersey state trooper, who said it's critical that whistleblowers seek therapy with those who specialize in PTSD and whistleblowing. She mentioned she spent decades sort of in the wind and found a specialist a year ago who's helped enormously. So it's not just about getting help, but getting the right help and making sure that you're properly cared for. We are getting some questions here, and I know we don't have a ton of time. So I think Shannon and Art, this one is probably going to go to you, but in the absence of any type of national legislation to fix this, so much of the progress is going to have to come down to decision making with law enforcement executives in creating an environment that supports this kind of reporting and creating processes that appropriately protect the people who report. And someone asked in the comments, what is the root cause of why law enforcement tends to attack whistleblowers, and what can be done from sort of a law enforcement leadership perspective to maybe start to address some of those root causes and at least see some improvements at an agency level?
Well, let me just say that having gone through this, I believe it's made me a better leader. I believe that we have a system, a process, procedures, laws for a reason. And I always tell the people that I've led in my career that we should never go after somebody for exercising their right. And when they are actually legitimately blowing the whistle for exercising their moral obligation and their lawful obligation. So I think that what leadership needs to do is make sure that they create a safe space. What I've done was when people blow the whistles, I make sure right away that I call in the people that may be the subject of those allegations and put them on notice that I will not, that any type of retaliation would not be tolerated. And I also bring in the person in most instances, if they want, you're not going to force them, but I want them to know that there's a safe space and that they're going to be safe. And I've told them that if there's an issue, that they need to come forward and let me know as the chief right away, so we can take immediate appropriate action. And in many instances, what we will do is we'll actually move the person to put them kind of like in the witness protection program, right, where we create we move out of the path of danger, and then if it involves a chain of command, and somebody of power, I've always removed that person to create the safe space, so that when the investigation starts, that employees you're signaling, number one, that you're taking the allegations seriously. And number two, that individual that may be a person in a position of power is not in the workplace intimidating, paying attention to what's going on, potentially retaliating. So if you do all of that, I think you create an environment and a culture where people will feel that they're going to be, if they come forward, they're going to be believed. Secondly, they're going to be protected. And thirdly, that their concerns will be thoroughly, objectively investigated.
So Art, you talked as to how you would resolve this, and that's amazing that you're willing to do that. And if only the powers to be and positions that you're in departments across the nation would follow your lead. And I think the more people like you talk out about it, the more open and the discussion, the more discussions we have, people are going to, by our pressure, have to change the status quo. But I wanted to address, the student says, what is the root cause? Why is this happening? Well, I want to tell you what I learned. So when I was working, the chief of IED, Internal Affairs Division, whose sole job is to root the department of corrupt officers, is the only one in the police department that was allowed to have knowledge of our investigation on the federal end. And we could not understand why we could not get police cooperation at the higher levels within the department. Why were so many bosses against Operation Brass Tacks being successful? And this chief, who was not on our side, but a lot of times they pretend, to be said, it's not that they give a crap about what's going to jail or your investigation. What they're afraid of is you discovering the skeletons in their closet. And so he explained that when you start out at a patrol level, you start with these people and then they're moved through the ranks. So maybe in the beginning, you don't inventory all the money from a street stop, or you don't inventory all the narcotics, or you do an illegal search warrant and you rise through the ranks. And now these people committing bigger crimes, they have dirt on you. So you cannot, what I was told by a chief is, I cannot allow this type of corruption to thrive by turning a blind eye for nearly 2 decades and now try to prosecute them without landing myself in federal prison. So when you go along with the status quo and cover up on a smaller level, and then, oh, this is my best buddy, we go, and you do it, now it's big. It's a Ronald Watts scandal. You no longer have your authority as a chief to do your job because you did so many favors lower down the line that they can tell on you and they can put you in prison too. So it doesn't stop at this level, it goes up. And that's a lot of times the reason why they go against the whistleblower, not what they're currently investigating, but what they might discover in their investigation that can actually land them in prison.
Excellent points all around. Thank you so much. This panel is flying by. I think we probably have time for one more question. And I'd actually like to pitch to you all a statement just to get your reactions to this, because I imagine a lot of people watching and sort of witnessing what it is that you all have endured probably have come to a similar conclusion. But this person states, if someone with a family asks me about making a disclosure, I always have to tell them that it's best to remain silent and it's not worth putting your family through it all. And I'm just curious how each of you would respond to that kind of statement based on your own experiences.
Well, I don't think you always get a choice. When I started my whistleblowing process, I thought I was doing the right thing. I was following policy guidance. I didn't think I was whistleblowing. So I don't know that we start this thinking that we're taking on these huge cases. And then I do think these are individual decisions. You know, we obviously want to encourage people to be whistleblowers, but I think a lot of whistleblowers also need to be mindful of making informed decisions on their next steps, because the how it blows up, how it becomes adversarial, you know, there are two parties involved in that. So you have to think through what you're doing and how you're doing it. I remember once working with a young employee who was sending his boss just these outrageous emails. And finally I said to him, look, stop emailing your boss. And his boss had him arrested for malingering or menacing behavior. I mean, it was just this ugly situation. And when we started like, okay, let's look at how you're writing these emails. And I was able to coach him and write some of them for him. He ended up getting his job back, moved to another location. I mean, he got everything he wanted by just sort of changing his approach to de-escalate and work on his communication skills. He now has 2 children and he's still employed. They dropped the court case, which was amazing. And it's like worked out. But I think until you really think about how your approach is working or not working, or how you change your strategy, if you have to change your strategy, really informs how you move forward in your whistleblowing.
I have to say, as law enforcement, as a police officer, we take an oath to serve and protect. You know, our job, we take this job to come on to fight crime, to be a voice and an advocate for those that don't have a voice, right? So I feel as law enforcement, you should be cut. I'm cut from the cloth and I believe most whistleblowers are. It's a choiceless choice, right? We take that oath, we honor that oath. And like Jackie said, I never looked at this situation and said, I'm going to be a whistleblower. Absolutely not. Every single day, I did the right thing to further the investigation, to follow the process. And what I discovered is by doing this, the powers to be were not doing their job. So I had to go outside of the box. But as law enforcement, I don't think there is a choice. You took this job. It is your obligation. If you see criminal conduct within the police department, you need to report it, because if you don't, you are no better than the officers committing the crime. If you have knowledge and you remain silent, you are not an officer I want to work with, nor are you an officer that any boss with integrity wants working underneath them. And I can tell you, as a whistleblower, most officers go and they serve with great respect and integrity every day. We don't want to work with the corrupt ones. So if you are contemplating blowing the whistle as law enforcement and you decide not to, I think you really need to reconsider if you are in the right field, because you have an obligation. Now, you can be smart about how you do it, but it's not a choice. You have to, and you have outlets and help to help you get through this. But at the very minimum, you have to make it known That's what your oath is about. So I think in law enforcement, you can be smart about how you do it. It is negative. It's negatively going to impact you, but you took that oath for a reason, and I hope you honor it, is what I can say.
I'll just say very quickly that it is a duty, but in defense of law enforcement, because we're focusing on law enforcement, just look at the 787 Supermax, right? Where we've seen now someone had to blow the whistle on Boeing, and rather than putting people in prison that lied, executives, they paid $1 billion fine, I believe it was. That's my recollection. So I think that what we need to look forward, what we need to look to next is the government has a lot of immunities. The individuals that actually engage in the retaliation, rarely does anything come out of their pocket. And maybe at some point we need to really consider that when there's whistleblowing, that it's a criminal offense when you retaliate. When there's clear-cut retaliation against legitimate whistleblowers, because we also have people that misuse of the process because they're in trouble themselves, right? So if the facts and the evidence show that we had a legitimate whistleblower, there was retaliation, we have got to come up with laws where the people that are committing the retaliation have skin in the game. And to me, that means that they need to have some consequences, and I'm not sure there's enough of them to protect the people now.
Excellent points all around. Well, we are at time. Unfortunately, there's quite a few more questions in the chat. I think maybe an hour isn't quite long enough to solve this issue. So we might have to be looking for some future discussions. Siri, anything to share in closing?
Yes, that was a fantastic panel. Thank you so much. I just really want to reaffirm everything you said about it being a duty to blow the whistle. It really lit me up, because that's the premise for the decision that the Constitutional Congress made in 1777, which we celebrate every year on July 30th, which was that it is not only a protected action, but it is the duty of all persons in service of the states to report misconduct to Congress or any other authority that can intervene in that misconduct. So this is something that goes to the heart of the founding of our country. And it's so wonderful to have you all participating in this discussion and encouraging others to come forward and think about the implications of coming forward. It really does strengthen our first responder community. It strengthens our police force. It helps protect the public from the kinds of misconduct that make us especially vulnerable to these authority figures, which you all are. And I really just want to say thank you for sharing your insights on